You would not believe the silence in that training room the second Maya came forward. It wasn't the relaxed, intent kind of silence you get before a major briefing. No, this was more intense, cutting around the edges, the kind of silence that makes you feel you are conscious of each and every movement you have. The kind of silence where even the noise of a boot hitting the floor sounds too loud. She stood there, a young woman in tightly pressed, cadet fatigues, shoulders squared, chin tilted upward slightly, eyes focused intently on the big mission board at the front of the room. The sunlight pouring through the tall windows lit her face, emphasizing her peaceful expression, but anyone who really looked could see the minute tension in her jaw. Every single cadet in the room was staring at her, not with the casual curiosity of new recruits meeting someone for the first time, but with the unspoken weight of judgment. Some whispered just low enough that their words blended into the hum of the overhead lights. Some smirked, their eyes darting to each other with that silent, knowing exchange that didn't need words. Some just shook their heads, not angrily, not even openly in dislike, but silently dismissing. To them, she wasn't Cadet Brooks. She wasn't Maya. She was the black soldier's daughter, a designation that, in their minds, said her entire tale before she ever had a chance to utter a single word. It wasn't a name they used with respect or even with great interest. It was a term, a tidy little container to put her in, a means of expressing, we already know who you are and you don't need to demonstrate anything because, well, you can't. They thought she was here due to her father, Captain Daniel Brooks, a highly decorated army man whose service was the sort that people mentioned in hushed tones, a man who had hung medals on his chest for acts of courage that most people wouldn't hear about in entirety. A man whose death had been memorialized with a folded flag, a last salute, and a couple of paragraphs in the local newspaper. The cadets had determined, without ever telling her to her face, that Maya did not have any right to be in the program. They believed that it had been awarded, not achieved, a favor. A gesture in remembrance of her deceased father. In their minds, her story was already written. She would be the one who always came second, the one who stayed in the background, the one who faded quietly out of the program when things got too hard. What they didn't notice, couldn't notice, were the years that preceded her. The dawn runs down deserted streets when the air remained cold enough to hurt her cheeks. The floor push-ups in the living room until her arms shook because she didn't want anyone to suspect she couldn't match them. The notebooks full of maps, strategy lists, and survival information she'd studied late at night after her friends were asleep. They had no idea of the nights she slept restlessly, lying awake and rehearsing her father's final words to her. He'd not spoken any great or ritualistic words. He'd simply said, "Lead from the front, but don't forget who's behind you." She'd kept those words in her heart like a compass. Now, standing in the hallway, she sensed the pressure of all those silent judgments coming at her from all sides. She could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Does she belong here at all? Can she keep up with us? Will she fall apart the first time things get difficult? Her boots thudded softly as she stepped towards the middle of the room. She didn't quicken or slacken. Each step was firm, purposeful, as though each one was an unspoken reply to those questions. Yes, I belong. Yes, I can keep pace. And no, I will not break. Against the front of the room, the mission board towered over everything else. Columns of names, goals, and team assignments were taped in trim rows. The scent of coffee and floor wax, the sort of smell that you only really become aware of if you stop moving, hung in the air. She arrived at the board and stopped, allowing her eyes to roam over the list until they reached her name, Brooks Maya, and the same block lettering as all the rest, but suddenly burdensome. She could sense their gaze upon the small of her back, a snicker here, an arched brow there, a shifting of weight and agitation. She knew the whispers would resume the minute she stepped aside, but what they did not understand, what they could not possibly understand, was that this day, this moment, would not turn out the way they thought it would. For because the very individual they were ridiculing, the one whom they thought would flub, would be in charge soon. And when things got real, not theoretical, not practice, but the kind of scenario where cooperation made all the difference between success and failure, those same cadets would have to determine if they trusted her enough to obey. Maya did not turn to confront them, not yet. Rather, she gave herself the briefest of breaths, the sort you take when you lock something away deep within. The frustration, the skepticism, the bite of being underestimated. She held her eyes straight ahead, her shoulders squared. She remembered her father again, not the medal. Not the uniform, but the man who taught her how to tie her boots before she went off to school, who demonstrated to her how to read a map without a compass, who explained to her that leadership was not about being the most vocal voice in the room, but the one that spoke when it was needed. and she thought of what he would say if he were here now, watching her stand in this room full of doubt. She imagined his voice, steady and sure. Don't waste your breath proving yourself to them. Let your actions speak, and let them be loud. From somewhere in the back of the room, a chair creaked. A pen clicked against the clipboard. Tiny, everyday sounds, but amidst that oppressive silence, they seemed magnified. Maya turned then, not a hasty look around, but a slow, deliberate sweep of the room. She scanned the faces, did not rest on any particular person, but ensured they all knew she was aware of them. She did not say a word, but she didn't need to, because this wasn't the time to speak up. That time would come, and when it arrived, the noise in this room would no longer be silence. It would be the noise of them hearing. For the time being, she just gazed back at the mission board, following the route her name would follow over the next few days. A route that, if she followed it correctly, would change everything. They did not even know that this silent, near-habitual moment was the beginning of something that they would never forget for the rest of their lives. Maya's father, Captain Daniel Brooks, was not a type of man who had to boast about his accomplishments in order to earn respect. His presence did the job. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of quiet confidence that came from years of having to overcome challenges most men could only dream of. He worked on some of the toughest overseas missions, the ones that didn't make the news but helped shape the world in ways few people understood. He had been sent into areas where the very air seemed thick with tension, where seconds counted and life-altering decisions were made. The tales he returned with weren't stories of heroism or glory, not the way films portrayed it. They were stories of people, of the guy soldier who gave away his last water canteen in the desert, of the medic who remained behind to tend to a hit civilian even when the route forward was treacherous, of the interpreter who risked everything for the unit. To young Maya, those tales weren't merely bedtime stories, they were lessons. The walls of his small Virginia home were filled with reminders of his service. Over the mantel, a carefully framed set of his medals, each in its own individual compartment, waited patiently for visitors. The Bronze Star, awarded for his acts of bravery in the face of enemy fire. The Distinguished Service Medal, for leadership beyond the call of duty, and the tiny silver pin from his first deployment, aged to a tarnish but worth more to her than gold. Her father never wore those medals for display. To him, they were not trophies. They reminded him, not just of what he'd accomplished, but of the women and men who stood alongside him and of sacrifices that all of them had made. Maya was raised in a household where discipline was accompanied by warmth. Her father wasn't strict because he wanted to be. If he had her wake up early, it was so she could witness the loveliness of a sunrise on a still morning run. If he had her learn to fold her clothes precisely, it was so she'd understand that neatness in little things led to neatness in large things. There was no because I said so in the Brooks family. Everything had a purpose, a reason, and if Maya did not get it yet, her dad would patiently explain, sometimes verbally, sometimes through example. The house was different after Captain Brooks died. The quiet seemed to reach further. The mounted medals on the wall sparkled in a manner that made her pause and gaze a bit longer than usual. She was young, but at that moment she felt otherwise. She knew, in a way she had not before, what it is to live by example, not by mantra. She knew that her father's life was one of service, not advancement, and alone in that house, she promised herself something. She would continue that same fire, not only by dressing in a uniform, but by living in a manner that respected the values he'd instilled in her. Years down the line, when she signed up for the state's Advanced Cadet Leadership Program, it seemed like more than a step in her schooling. It seemed like holding good on that promise. She had struggled to get there. Early mornings, long runs, PT and rain and sun and snow and dark, and studying maps and history and survival for hours on end. She didn't want anyone to be able to say that she had been given something, but what she didn't anticipate was the polite wall of uncertainty that met her the minute she stepped into that program. It wasn't overt hostility. Nobody yelled at her or asked her to leave. It was more insidious, and in a sense harder to accept. The sidelong glances, the arched brows when her name was read during roll, the hesitation in the conversation when she entered the room. To most of the cadets, she wasn't there on her own merit. She was there because of her father's reputation. They didn't necessarily say it, but she could see it in their faces. She's riding her father's coattails. It didn't matter if she did drills in a shorter time than others. It didn't matter if she might read a map faster or execute a rescue knot in record time. There was always someone prepared with an under-the-breath remark. Well, her father just taught her that, or she's had a head start her entire life. Maya attempted to brush it off initially. She concentrated on training, kept her head down, and informed herself that actions spoke louder than words. But the remarks, even if whispered, reached her, and every time they hurt. Not because they questioned her ability, but because they belittled her effort. Her father had never been a man who accepted excuses. Not from him and not from anyone else. And now, here she was, confronting people who had chosen to believe that regardless of what she did, it would not be her own success. It could have been simple for her to pull back, to do the minimum amount of work and just coast through her time in the program. But that wasn't her. And more importantly, that wasn't who her father had taught her to be. She recalled something he had said to her one day after a really difficult day at school. She'd come home angry over a group assignment in which her contribution had been ignored. He'd listened patiently, then advised her, "Maya, you don't dictate if people acknowledge your work. You dictate if you offer it regardless." Those words stayed with her, and in the weeks that followed, she decided she wasn't going to spend her time convincing them with arguments. She was going to convince them with results. Nevertheless, at the bottom of her heart, she recognized that achievements alone would not suffice. Respect, she had understood from her father, isn't necessarily gained by talent. It's gained by moments when stakes are high, when character counts higher than talent. What she didn't realize yet was that such a moment was nearer than she assumed, and when it arrived, it would not only challenge all of the lessons her father had ever instructed her, it would compel the very individuals who questioned her to decide if they would follow her path. The reversal came on a chilly March morning. The kind of morning where the air bites at your skin before you've even stepped outside, where the frost on the windows turns everything beyond the glass into a blur of pale blue and silver. Inside the training hall, the heat had been turned up just enough to take the edge off, but it couldn't warm the kind of anticipation hanging in the air. Cadets stood in loose groups, their whispers low, their boots scraping the floor as they anticipated the morning briefing. Some had their backs against walls, others sat with elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the clock. It was procedural, or so it seemed, until the door at the far end of the room opened. The commanding officer entered. He was a tall figure, constructed like a man who spent years in the field before settling behind a desk. And even now, his movements held the soft precision of a soldier who never completely let his guard down. In one hand, he clutched a brown folder tightly under his arm. In the other, a rolled map. The moment he entered, conversation stopped. He didn't have to say a word. His presence alone brought the room to attention. There was something in his face, an intensity that caused even the most self-assured cadets to sit up straighter in their seats. His boots rang off the floor as he strode up to the front of the room. Standing before the mission board, he placed the folder on the lectern, unrolled the map, and let it click flat against the surface. "This," he started, his voice with measured authority, "will challenge all that you have learned." He paused before the next words. Leadership, strategy, perseverance. He paused over each of them in turn, allowing them to hang in the air for an instant before continuing. "If you don't cooperate, you will fail completely." That's it. The cadets edged forward, their gaze flicking from the map to the officer's face. "This is the 3-day survival and rescue simulation," he went on, his finger on the sketch of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The map's terrain was indicated with twisting trails, streams, and the cross-hatching of shaded areas for elevation, familiar to some, daunting to others. For all participants in the program, this was not some other exercise. This was the test, the year's hardest. Teams would be dispatched into the wilderness with minimal gear, a list of tasks, and a tight time constraint. They'd have to travel in difficult terrain, find lost team members, establish camp, and stage simulated rescues, all under uncertain weather and limited communication. It was the sort of test where you found out sooner rather than later if you could rely on the person standing next to you. The officer's eyes moved deliberately around the room, locking with the gaze of cadet after cadet, and then it rested on Maya. His voice held no doubt when he replied, "Brooks, you'll command Alpha Team." The atmosphere changed in an instant. It wasn't boisterous, no gasps or outcry, but you could sense it. A muted rustle as individuals adjusted in their seats, the rapid passing of glances, one cadet's eyebrow rising ever so minimally, another releasing a brief, arid laugh before masking it with a cough. The subtext in those responses was unmistakable. Maya sensed the gravity of all their gazes shifting in her direction, the intangible force of their unvoiced skepticism bearing down upon her shoulders. It was as if every hushed remark she'd heard throughout the previous weeks had collectively made an entrance into the room, dancing around her like wisps of smoke. For a brief moment, she felt her gut knot up. Her mind ran through every time she had been underestimated, every time someone had glanced past her at the person behind her, and then just as fast, another voice cut through the din, not from the room, but from memory, her father's voice. Leadership isn't about proving them wrong, he had told her once. His tone even and steady. It's about doing what's right, even when no one believes in you. She was able to imagine him there, seated at her kitchen table, a coffee cup between his knees, the dawn light breaking across the edges of his uniform. His eyes had been steady but intense, the sort of glance that made you feel the rest of the world had peeled away, and all that was left was the reality of his words. That recollection grounded her. She stood up straight, the clench in her jaw relaxed sufficiently for her voice to remain clear. "Understood, sir." 2 words, but she said them with the soft confidence of someone not seeking permission. She received a curt nod from the officer before he continued, announcing the remainder of the team assignments. Names were assigned, partners were paired, and groups started forming. And even as the briefing proceeded, Maya sensed the stares aimed in her direction. Some were inquisitive, others were dubious. 1 or 2, although she wouldn't say so out loud, were practically anticipatory, as though they were waiting for her to stumble before she even began. She didn't let it register, but deep down she could sense something change. This wasn't about getting the simulation done anymore. This was about entering a place where her actions would be more powerful than her name, where each choice would either create trust or destroy it. The officer completed the briefing, delivering last-minute instructions regarding safety procedures, supply check-ins, and the simulated emergency signals they'd be employing in the field. Once he dismissed the team, the room erupted into the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of boots, and the low murmur of conversation. Maya headed to the equipment area to retrieve her pack, already mentally going over potential routes, tactics, and backup plans. She had learned to expect the Blue Ridge Mountains to be volatile this time of year. Morning fog, slick trails after rain, temperatures plunging at night. She also realized that she'd not only have to worry about her own safety, but that of every member of Alpha Team, including the ones who didn't believe she had a right to be commanding them in the first place. And that, she reflected with a steady determination, was precisely the sort of challenge her father would have wanted her to take on. The Blue Ridge Mountains' first morning was accompanied by a sting, a biting cold rain that penetrated directly into the bones. It wasn't the kind of drizzle you could easily shrug off. This was the sort of rain that made dirt slippery clay, wet boots in minutes, and caused even the toughest cadets to quietly wish they were in a warm bunk. The clouds clung low, devouring the mountain peaks, and the wind sliced through each layer of clothing as if it had a vendetta. Maya zipped her jacket up, the clammy material digging against her skin. She'd risen before morning, looked at the map, double-checked their path, and silently prayed the weather would let them have a break. It hadn't. And now, as Alpha Team struggled through, she could already feel the resistance simmering just below the surface. They weren't openly rebellious, not yet, but the indications were there. Cadets deliberately falling behind, others mouthing off to one another rather than passing information up the line. Some opting for the longer, dirtier routes when she'd specifically instructed them to take the safer, shorter route. None of it was enough to bring about a complete breakdown, but it was enough to make the message clear: we don't trust you. At noon, their pace was slower than it ought to have been. The rain refused to abate, and each step taken seemed to be taken with twice the work. They halted to put up a hasty tarp for lunch, but the atmosphere was anything but congenial. Some cadets shunned her gaze. Others conversed with one another in tight-lipped manner. Their voices carried just enough that she caught snippets of phrases such as coattails and lucky pick. She ignored it, at least outwardly. Inside, she could feel the doubt trying to creep in. She reminded herself of her father's words. You're not here to win their approval. You're here to do the job. The work got a great deal more challenging toward late afternoon. The river crossing had seemed manageable initially. Knee-deep water, solid rocks, nothing too hazardous. But the rain had swollen the current, so it was faster and more slippery than she'd calculated. The cadets crossed one by one, holding on to the guide rope they'd strung between 2 trees. The last to cross was Cadet Lewis, tall and wide-shouldered but heavy-footed. Halfway out, his boot slid on the green coating on the stone. The current pulled his legs from under him, and he crashed into the water. The noise, the piercing splash, and the harsh, frightened gasp spiked adrenaline in Maya's blood. She was already running to the rope when others finally moved. "Grab hold of the rope, Lewis," she shouted. Her voice cut through the turmoil of water. 2 cadets attempted to grab him, but the current whirled him around sideways, pulling him into a broken rock. That's when they all noticed it. The way he grasped at his knee, the grimace that indicated something had twisted or torn. When they finally pulled him up onto the bank, he was white and trembling, his leg twisted at a crooked angle. Panic set in among the group. Some debated whether to continue forward or send someone on ahead to get help. One cadet proposed breaking the group up. Another maintained that they would wait until rescue came. That was when Maya realized caution might cost them more than time. She knelt down by Lewis, her hands calm as she probed the wound. The rain continued to fall, the temperature was dropping, and they were running out of daylight. "Listen to me," she instructed, standing up. Her voice was even but held a firmness that broke through the din. "We get him to higher ground, we provide shelter, and we stick together. No one goes alone." The tone allowed no argument. She set to work quickly assigning tasks. 2 of the cadets would assist in carrying Lewis. One would scavenge any waterproof material they had. 2 others would scout ahead 30 yards and look for an appropriate place to camp. Maya emptied out her own pack of useless gear, using straps and poles to assist in making a makeshift stretcher. They were on the move within 15 minutes. When they finally discovered a small ridge with sufficient shelter from the wind, it was almost dark. Maya instructed them to pitch the tents, construct a windbreak out of fallen branches, and ignite a fire. She did not shout, but there was something in her voice now, the confidence, the authority, that made even the most questioning cadets obey without reluctance. When the fire finally roared to life, heating them both with its warm light against the rainy darkness, she sat beside Lewis, feeling his pulse and helping him move into a more comfortable position. She offered him water, then softly told him they'd make it through the next 2 days. Later that evening, Maya made the rotations, 2 to tend the fire, 2 to scout for wildlife, and 2 to take turns resting. She patrolled the perimeter twice herself, boots squelching through mud, looking out into the shadows for signs of danger. At dawn on the second day, the rain had lightened into a mist. The air remained cold, but the fire and a decent night's sleep had lightened everyone's disposition. They prepared to leave, proceeding more slowly this time to avoid jolting Lewis. Maya had read the map by the flickering light last night and discovered a safer bypass of the steep slope that they were supposed to ascend. It was an additional mile, but it was dry land and less taxing on Lewis's leg. By the close of the second day, even those cadets who had rolled their eyes at her first morning were seeking her opinion before they acted. The resistance of silence had dissipated, and instead was something new, respect, building quietly, like sparks on damp wood. When the sun started to come up that last morning, the Blue Ridge Mountains were shrouded in a gentle mist, the sort of mist that makes everything seem hushed, nears. Maya's boots were filled with water, her uniform all dirt crusted, and her muscles screamed in places she couldn't even find with her hands. None of it mattered, though. Nothing at all compared to what she saw when she looked over her shoulder. Alpha Team, her crew, remained with her. The unexpected injuries to Kyle, the cadet, had him leaning on a crude crutch they'd made from a sturdy branch and ripped webbing straps. He walked with a consistent but unexpected limp. 2 of the team members walked beside him, close enough to be ready to catch unexpected rocks or roots in the path. Another cadet, who'd loudly mocked Maya's leadership in the past, now bore the last of the equipment without complaint. They had endured freezing rain, seemingly infinite hills, and more than one point when it would have been easier to quit than continue. And yet here they stood in one piece, together, and, amazingly, still on time. As the trees finally parted and the clearing opened to show the last checkpoint, a group of military tents, the American flag flapping in the wind, and the commanding officer standing tall with a clipboard, Maya felt a surge of relief, not for herself, for them. For the people who had followed her through the worst of it, even if they hadn't begun believing in her. They marched into camp, each step heavy but determined. Mud grime covered their faces, their uniforms were torn and crumpled. But there was something in their eyes now, the look of individuals who had been tested by something real, something that pushed them not merely physically, but in ways that could not be quantified by drills or checklists. The commanding officer, Captain Harris, didn't say a word immediately. He allowed them to stand there, gasping for air as his glance swept between the faces. At last, he looked at Maya. "Alpha Team," he declared, voice echoing through the still morning air. "You arrived early. All members accounted for. Wounded team members stabilized and safely transported. Each checkpoint taken, there was a silence, the sort that made everyone stand a little taller. Then, breaking into a seldom-seen smile, he said, 'Outstanding leadership, Brooks. Your father would have been proud.' The words hit her like a wave. She could feel her throat constrict. It wasn't that he had spoken to her. It was the manner in which he had done it, the manner that seemed to mean something, as if he had seen her, and not just whose daughter she happened to be. Something around her shifted. There were no smirks anymore, no hushed comments, no side looks wondering if she deserved to be there. Instead, she was greeted by the ring of applause, slow at first, then constant, sincere. Her teammates came forward one by one. Some gave her a firm grip of the hand, others nodded a swift acknowledgement. A few clapped her on the back, their eyes more eloquent than words. It wasn't dramatic, no swelling music or great speeches. It was something more subdued, more profound, the kind of moment you hold with you for the rest of your life. Maya did not smile from pride. She smiled because she realized at last something her father had lived his life by. Respect is not inherited. It is not a medal on your chest or engraved on a plaque. It is not awarded because of your birth, your rank, or the shadow of someone else's achievement. Respect is earned, step by step, choice by choice. It's built in the moments when no one is watching, when you take the harder path because it's the right one, when you protect the people who depend on you even if they doubt you, when you lead not for recognition but because someone has to. That survival exercise had been designed to test their physical limits. But for Maya, it had tested something else entirely, her belief in herself. In the beginning, the weight of their doubt had felt like a chain around her shoulders. Every skeptical glance, every muttered comment had been another link in that chain. But along the way between the icy river crossing and the grueling ascent up, that final ridge, the chain began to snap, not because she challenged their judgment directly, but because she earned it in the only way that really counted, by showing up time and again when it really mattered. And as they assembled for the formal debrief, she saw one, Cadet, the same, by the way, who had laughed when her name was called to lead Alpha Team, standing aside. He hesitated, then approached. "You did good out there," he said, not quite looking at her eyes at first. Then, with a small smile, "Guess I was wrong." Maya didn't brag. She didn't have to. Instead, she just nodded. "We all survived," she said. "That's what counts." And she wasn't lying. Later, as the camp was packing up, she took a quiet stroll to the edge of the field. The fog was beginning to clear, and the entire line of the mountains in the distance became visible green, solid, and unmoved by the storms that swept over them. She remembered her father, the stories he had told her of soldiers who shared nothing other than the purpose they shared, and how, ultimately, that was enough to make strangers into brothers and sisters. She had lived one of those tales now. The murmur that had once followed her across the training hall was absent. Not because she'd spoken over it in rage or bitter words, but because she'd earned something greater than silence. She'd earned trust. She'd earned loyalty. And above all, she'd earned the kind of respect no one could ever take from her. When she arrived back at camp, Alpha Team was packing their equipment for the drive home. Someone shouted her name, beckoning her over. As she approached, she felt something significant. She was no longer the black soldier's daughter. She was their commander, and they respected that.